Welcome to part 1 of 3 videos on Elizabeth Anderson's Objections to Locke Egalitarianism. And so this is going to be 3 parts, which is going to be pretty long, but I think what Elizabeth Anderson has to say is pretty important, and I hope to sort of cover it in some detail so that you don't really have to read through 30-odd pages of what is the point of equality and still get the gist of what she's trying to say. And if you're interested in sort of narrowing down on her thoughts, you can actually go and read through it. So as you can see from the background of this particular slide, Elizabeth Anderson's thought has sort of not only been very philosophically important, as I will sort of mention in a short while, but also that it has also become a very important way of reshaping and rethinking what equality is in mainstream social thought and also political thought. And that's going to be important, I hope, to see why as we go and examine her view. So I'm going to say a bit more about precisely why I think this is important shortly. So some background. The paper which we are sort of discussing here is What is the Point of Equality, which is a blockbuster paper of 52 pages where Anderson does what Cohen did in that paper that you read, where she sort of has a series of arguments against various egalitarian positions, but she also does actually a pretty good job of articulating her positive view, although not fully, which is why I assigned another paper related to the positive view that she articulates about relational egalitarianism. So the reason why I say this is one of the most important papers is because it did precisely that, right? So we have been studying the history of welfarism, more or less. We have actually tracked it pretty closely, right? From utilitarianism to desire satisfaction to objective lists and all the various views, how they move from welfarism to equality of welfare and so on, right? And then there's a clustering of views of Locke egalitarianism, and in just one paper, right, Anderson sort of actually introduces a totally new framework of thinking about equality. And that not only sets the scene for a new way of thinking about moral and political philosophy, I think, but also for PPE, because it's actually really, as I hope to illustrate in the in-class session, is a new way of thinking about how politics, philosophy, and economics actually interact, right? It's not just about thinking about welfare, it is also thinking about how does the basic structure of our institutions actually are justifiable to one another to enable us to relate to others as equals, right? And that has institutional implications, that has economic implications, and it also has philosophical implications. Right? But before we get to that, the main thing that this paper really did was to challenge the prevailing notion of equality as pertaining to the distribution of something. Right? This sort of question about what should we distribute, and we have seen various versions of this. Right? We've seen people talk about utility, about welfare, about resources, and then opportunity of welfare. So we've sort of tracked this as we've gone along, as I've said. And Anderson wants to argue that thinking about this idea of equality as kind of material benefit is mistaken, right? Because equality shouldn't be understood solely or even primarily in terms of material benefits, but in terms of social relations. And as I've already alluded to, this reframing creates new ways of thinking about why economic inequality is a threat to society. Right? It sort of opens up new avenues of thinking. How is it that economic inequality threatens our social relations? Something that, if you are just concerned about welfare, that's kind of a secondary issue, right? But if you are relational egalitarian, that's something that you are particularly concerned about. And as we will see, that sort of gives you a new way of rethinking and reshaping our thinking about economic inequality. And I think you can also see a vein of this thought in Scanlon. So when we're discussing the Anderson, we'll try to bring together the Scanlon and the Anderson, although we'll foreground the Anderson a lot more. So we've already seen, I already sort of discussed this actually, right? About the three views: welfarism, resourcism, relational egalitarianism, and how they sort of all relate to one another, as it were. The three major views, right? And then we've discussed Godin, Anderson, Rawls, and Dawkins. And then, of course, in this week, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Anderson. And I think the chart shows you quite nicely, right, that there's this idea that, first of all, relational egalitarianism is sort of opposed to welfarism and resourcism, but is also opposed to the views which are sort of like clustered under both, which is Luck egalitarianism, which is the focus of what we want to look at today. So, agenda for this series of videos. First of all, we're going to examine Anderson's objections to Luck egalitarianism. Then we're going to examine her general diagnosis for why Luck egalitarianism has gone wrong. And then we're going to briefly outline the alternative relational egalitarianism, or what she calls democratic equality. They're sort of used interchangeably nowadays. So, if you recall, way back in the first week, I introduced a few basic assumptions of the class. And one of them is this idea that all individuals are moral equals. Now, what does it mean to treat people as moral equals? Now, one common answer, as you see in Dawkins, as you also see in Cohen and Anderson, right, is this idea that we should treat people with equal respect. And we should show equal concern for each other. You know, this is sort of like almost as close as you get to a meaningless platitude, right? Then you say you will treat people with equal respect, equal concern, but what does that actually mean, right? And as we have seen, right, theorists disagree over this quite divergently, right? So if you ask a welfarist, what does it mean to treat people with equal concern and equal respect, they will say, well, we should just ensure that everyone has equal utility, right? If you ask a utilitarian, they'll say, well, it's about maximizing welfare, but then on the whole, maybe we will just adopt rural utilitarianism, right? So that's the sort of varying answers to this question about how exactly to interpret these vague ideas. And so Anderson's argument is that Luck egalitarianism, I'm just going to call it LE for short, fails to meet the equal respect and concern test. I'm going to see why that's the case. And her general diagnosis is that Luck egalitarianism fails because it fails to provide a compelling basis for egalitarianism that is rooted in why we care about equality and how it also incorporates, and because Luck egalitarianism also incorporates the worst of socialism and capitalism, according to her. Now, why do I call it Luck egalitarianism? Actually, the labeling of the different views, Anderson, Cohen, Dawkins, as Luck egalitarians actually came from Anderson, right? Because that she notes, she was the first to say, well, look at all these people who seem to be disagreeing about welfare, whether welfare should be the basis of distribution or whether resources should be the basis of distribution. And actually, they have one sort of important thesis in common, right? Which is the idea of trying to sort of extinguish the influence of bad good luck, right? And try to equalize luck, as it were, right? So that's why she calls them the luck egalitarians. And the positive thesis that she has in mind is that if we have a relational understanding of equality, it does better than luck egalitarianism because it passes the equal concern and respect test, and it also provides a compelling basis for egalitarianism, unlike luck egalitarianism, because it explains that equality is rooted in enabling citizens to relate to one another as equals. Now, at this point, the term relate to one another as equals seems to be also very vague, right? So we're going to try to fill that in a bit more as we go along then in class and as you do the Anderson reading. Now on to the criticisms. But before we do that, let's get some idea about why, in particular, luck egalitarians are so concerned with accommodating responsibility. And that has got partly to do with the context in which they were writing in, where there were a lot of criticisms of egalitarianism along these lines. Right here you can see there's little doubt that many egalitarians are motivated at least partially by envy. This idea that people who are seeking equality, they are driven by this jealousy rather than sort of any rational or good moral reasons. You can see that also here. Again, envy is the root of the egalitarian ethos. Right? And there's also this a different version of this, right? Is that people don't want to work hard, but they are envious of what you have. That's why they want to sort of take away your wealth. And there's also this idea then that people who are seeking to redistribute wealth, they're sort of parasites upon those people who produce, and they don't actually do anything productive. And Anderson sort of notes that, curiously, many of the luck egalitarians that we have read in some way sort of represent that kind of thinking, right? So, for example, Dawkins thinks that equality of resources is envy-free. Anderson thinks that we cannot reasonably expect much from a person who finds work extremely adverse as we can from someone with a zest for hard work. Cohen thinks that we might compensate for gloominess or compensate for expensive tastes that are the results of one's circumstances. So these sort of things, these sort of luck egalitarian conclusions seem to be propping up the conservative suspicion that egalitarians are sort of driven by envy, driven by a willingness not to work, right? Or take other people's fruit of their labor, for example. Now, perhaps you might think, well, Anderson is being a bit unfair, right? But she does want to make a sort of more important point, right? Besides the snarky point, I think. And that is that when we look at luck egalitarianism, we become concerned with people like the doubly unfortunate person with Tiny Tim right? But when we think about inequality historically, right, we are concerned with inequality in terms of the politically oppressed, right? Inequality that is affected by inequalities of race, of gender, of class, of caste relations, right? It's this idea that the society by having sort of unequal relations, right, has sort of there's something wrong with that. And then her thought is that luck egalitarianism is sort of too focused on material benefits and sort of ignores this relational aspect of equality, right? What that means later, we'll get to that later on. So let's sort of look then more carefully at the basic motivation of luck egalitarianism. And you can see that the starting intuition for Locke egalitarianism is this idea that the genetic endowments that you have, they are sort of morally arbitrary, right? So if that is true, right, where you are born or the sort of talents that you have that you were born with, they're sort of not really important from the moral point of view. And so we shouldn't retain, or we shouldn't get to keep all the advantages that just are present due to this good fortune, right? Then Locke egalitarianism wants to take this very important insight that Elizabeth Anderson thinks is clearly right, and then shore up egalitarianism by arguing against the key objections that we've kind of mentioned earlier, some of them at least, right? Which is this got to do with this idea of responsibility, as we have discussed quite a lot, right? So the idea here is something like, first we sort of demarcate clearly what equality is, right? Then from there, inequalities that sort of emerge from that initial point of equality, they're sort of acceptable, right? So for Dawkins, for example, we have initial equality of resources, then inequality we fix using the insurance scheme, then subsequent inequality driven by the market is permissible, right? Now, of course, there might be need to fix that over time, as he notes, right? But then you use the insurance scheme again, and then it sort of continues, and then whatever inequality that goes in from the other point is okay. Then for Cohen, if you establish a vaguely equal advantage to access, and then subsequent inequality that results from the choice is acceptable. And for Anderson, it's roughly the same thing, whether you use EOW, equality of welfare, or use the prioritarian version, you have equal option sets. Then people make their choices, then the subsequent inequality that results from those choices is acceptable. Right, so to recap the sort of what is important here, the central agreement amongst Locke egalitarians is that attempting to accommodate responsibility within the frame of egalitarianism is very important, right? Because there's this idea that you must somehow make it clear that egalitarianism is not a free pass where people can just sort of live without consequences, as it were, right? People must take responsibility for their actions. And the central disagreement, as we have seen, is whether welfare should be included within the object of egalitarian concern, or whether resources should be the only metric of equality. And we have sort of tracked that debate as well. And we looked at how people might accommodate responsibility in the previous session. So now, Anderson's first argument is that when Locke egalitarians attempt to extinguish the influence of bad good luck and they focus on choice, that leads to some pretty absurd conclusions. So one example is, suppose that there's an accident, right? And now, immediately the people from the hospital sort of rush over, right? And they decide to administer aid, right? If we are living under a Locke egalitarian system, right? And if we say we adopt Dawkins' view, then we have to ask, okay, driver, are you insured? And if the driver says that, no, I didn't buy insurance, then for Locke egalitarianism to be consistent, seems that we must hold that we must leave them by the side of the road, right? That's what Anderson sort of argues, right? On this view, they have no claim to aid, right? But that sort of seems problematic, right? If the person is sort of in need, surely we should provide need there. Choice is not relevant. Right? Now, another case is, suppose that the driver loses their sight after the incident. Now, some Locke egalitarians, Anderson in one paper he says this, and Rakowski is a sort of even more extreme Locke egalitarian than Anderson and Dawkins, right? So he thinks that as long as you made a choice, right, you are sort of responsible, you should be held responsible for whatever disadvantage flows from that. So some Locke egalitarians hold that society has no obligation to accommodate their disability. So to make this example clearer, right? So imagine if the driver, as you can see here in this particular case, right, the driver loses their sight or can't see very well, for example, and then they bring their guide dog to the post office, right? Then the luck egalitarian will have to sort of show some way of saying, oh, you made a choice, and if you made a choice, then we shouldn't accommodate you. You cannot, the guide dog is not allowed, just like in this particular news article, right? But that again seems to be discriminatory towards the disabled, right? That's sort of a counterintuitive result. Another case is, suppose that you make a choice to live in an area where there's potential of hurricanes and other natural disasters. So we can see here the very famous San Andreas fault, right, where it's predicted that in future there'll be huge earthquakes. And you can see here also, this is after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the sort of destruction caused partly by the natural disaster, but mostly actually by the sort of poor infrastructure that they made. And people like Rakowski want to say is that these people made a choice to stay here, right? And if they made that choice, we shouldn't compensate them, right? And Anderson thinks that, well, this is what we would call geographical discrimination, right? Or how can you not extend it to people based on where they are living, right? We should sort of give them disaster relief nonetheless. Another sort of seemingly counterintuitive result is that Rakowski also says, suppose that people choose to be firefighters. And if they choose to do that, then we shouldn't also compensate them. But this again seems truly weird, right? If we have some functions that we need as a society we as a society acknowledge this is important, and people choose to help us, shouldn't we reward them instead of not compensating them? That's kind of a weird outcome, right? And finally, Anderson also says, what about people who make the choice, for example, to, especially women in this case, right? As you can see here, they spend 2 to 10 times more time on unpaid care work than men. They make a choice to, instead of making more money, spend more time doing caregiving jobs, work in the home, right? What about these people, right? On the luck egalitarian view, right? On luck egalitarian view, these people chose to care for their children, and they forgo other options, right? So, if just to sort of give one illustration of this idea, right? Suppose that a woman has maybe 5 options, right? And the man has 5 options. So they have equality of option sets along Anderson's view, right? Then the man chooses their first best option, but the woman, right, because of the societal norms, or even for her own, as a result of her own choice, for example, just chooses to help to go and look after their children and forgo the first best choice, and suppose that that's the third best choice in terms of their own overall well-being, because they don't earn that much money, right? Then the EOW says, well, equality of welfare has been satisfied, so that's it, right? There's no more sort of need to compensate other people, right? And that's the sort of argument that's presented here, right? Which is that we should compensate parents if their children, if they lack the resources to take care of their children, because their children shouldn't suffer from the bad good luck that their parents face, right? But if women choose to care for their children, and typically it's women, as we saw from the previous slide, that's why we focus on women here, right? Then they should not be compensated, even though that means that they're sort of in some kind of unequal relationship with the man, right, in the household. They are in a state of economic dependency and typically vulnerability, right? And to sort of give a bigger overview of this problem, right? As Romer writes, and Romer himself is a egalitarian, right, says the society should not compensate people for their choice of a more altruistic, self-sacrificing path because it owes people no compensation on account of their moral views. And here the idea is that if they choose to make sort of moral choice and then they choose that, then we shouldn't compensate them for that. And Anderson notes that if we had this kind of egalitarian society, right, one big question we're left with is how can we provide caregiving when caregivers are left in such a vulnerable state? Now, I think that as we will see shortly, right, there are certain elements of our society, especially Singaporean society, which tend to be quite cleaved along egalitarian lines. And this is not just pertaining solely to Singapore, but this is also a sort of broader, broader feature of many welfare policies all over the world, especially with respect to caregiving. And I think that this is not an ideal question, right? Which is how, given that caregiving tends to be unpaid, and the argument tends to be that something along the lines, well, if people choose to exit the workforce to do caregiving, we don't really owe them that many subsidies, right? We owe them some kind of support, but as a general matter, support tends to be, on the whole, not that strong, right? And the prevailing consensus amongst many societies is that we don't really need them to provide them any sort of compensation or equalization of potential losses that they might have made, right? And that sort of actually leaves, especially women, in a vulnerable state in the society, right? So one possible thought that many people have, which we will examine later, is that maybe UBI can be a way of actually counteracting this kind of problem, right? Because then people might be guaranteed a sort of basic minimum, and then that would sort of solve the problem in a way, right? But whether it does actually solve that problem is a question we will return to. So now that we have the problem, right, how do egalitarians sort of respond? Now, one clear response that egalitarians might have is, well, it's unfair to hold people responsible for the degree to which they are responsible agents, right? So it's this idea that the fact that people might act foolishly or not competently fully, right, we can't always hold them responsible for that, right? So we can sometimes, right, those people who might act imprudently, right, we can take action to protect them paternalistically. Is the problem solved? Right, so here's one sort of way of thinking about it is CPF, right? It's a way of sort of providing mandatory insurance as a sort of safeguard, right? To ensure that people make some kind of minimum savings, they have a certain degree of social insurance to protect them. And we will see why Anderson thinks that this might not be necessarily the best solution in the next video. Thank you for listening.